It was August 1944, northern France. The sky above the hedgerows was a pale gray sheet, heavy with smoke and the distant thud of artillery. Along a muddy road, a column of American M4 Shermans crawled forward, their engines humming with the steady rhythm of endurance. From the ridge, a German Tiger crew watched through binoculars, amused. The Tigers were heavier, their guns deadlier, their armor nearly invincible, or so they believed. To them, the Shermans looked like toys, thin-skinned, underpowered, and hopelessly outclassed. The German gunner whispered a joke, and the crew laughed, confident that one shell could turn any of those machines into a burning coffin. But as the hours turned into days, something strange happened. When the German tanks broke down, the Shermans kept moving. When the Tigers ran out of fuel, the Shermans rolled on. Through mud, dust, and battlefields, these weak machines kept driving, 2,000 miles without a single major failure. By the time the war ended, the Germans were no longer laughing. They had learned the most painful lesson of all. In modern war, it isn't just power that wins. It's the machine that never stops. The Second World War was, in many ways, a war of machines. Nowhere was this more evident than on the battlefields of Europe, where the contest for armored supremacy shaped the rhythm of entire campaigns. From the very first days of Blitzkrieg in 1939, German tanks spearheaded a revolution in warfare. Fast, coordinated, and precise, they carved through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying efficiency. At the heart of this lightning war were the panzer divisions, mobile formations blending speed, armor, and air power. German engineers, from Heinz Guderian's theories to Ferdinand Porsche's prototypes, saw tanks not as static fortresses but as instruments of maneuver, weapons of decision. The early models, like the Panzer III and I-4, were modest by later standards, but their tactical coordination made them nearly unstoppable. The Allies, in contrast, lagged behind. In 1940, British Matildas and French Char B-1s were impressive in armor but painfully slow. The Soviet Union had its revolutionary T-34, but it was still in limited service. The United States, watching from across the Atlantic, had no modern tank at all. When war reached North Africa in 1942, American crews rolled out with the M3 Lee, a tall, awkward machine with a side-mounted gun and poor visibility. The Germans, meanwhile, introduced something entirely new. The Tiger I unveiled in 1942, it was a fortress on tracks, 57 tons of steel, an 80-millimeter gun, and frontal armor that could shrug off most Allied rounds. German tankers quickly began to see themselves as elite warriors. The Tiger became not just a weapon but a symbol of engineering superiority, of German invincibility. When the M4 Sherman appeared that same year, it seemed unremarkable by comparison. Weighing barely 30 tons with a 75-millimeter gun and thinner armor, the Sherman didn't inspire fear. It was simpler, boxier, and far more lightly armed. Even its crews joked about it, calling it a Ronson after the cigarette lighter that lights every time. And yet, something subtle was happening beneath the surface. The Sherman was never meant to be a dueling tank. It was designed for mobility, production, and repairability. Its engine could run on low-octane fuel. Its suspension could be replaced in hours. Its parts were interchangeable. Its transmission easy to fix even in the mud. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. While German engineers obsessed over perfection, the Americans pursued consistency. In Detroit, the arsenal of democracy came alive. Dozens of factories, Ford, Chrysler, Fisher Body, produced thousands of identical Shermans every month. By late 1943, there were more than 10,000 in service across multiple continents. Where German tank units were lucky to field a few dozen Tigers, the Allies could deploy hundreds of Shermans, all sharing the same parts, the same tools, the same training manuals. By the time the Allies prepared to land in Italy and later in Normandy, the battlefield equation had shifted. The Tiger was still feared, a beast in one-on-one combat, but its shadow was shrinking. It was unreliable, prone to mechanical breakdowns, and so complex that maintenance crews often struggled to keep them running. For every Tiger that reached the front, several more were stranded by engine failures or fuel shortages. The Sherman, on the other hand, had become an army's heartbeat. Its crews might not have boasted about their armor, but they trusted their machines. They could start them in freezing weather, repair them under fire, and drive them across rivers and ruins with minimal support. The Sherman wasn't the strongest, but it was always there, and that constancy would soon prove decisive. By early 1944, the tank war had entered a new phase. The Germans relied on fewer, mightier weapons, the Panthers and Tigers, while the Allies relied on the machine that simply never stopped moving. And as the Allies prepared to cross into Normandy, no one yet knew that the tank once mocked by German crews would soon outlast the Reich itself. The German Tank Corps may have ruled the early years of the war, but by 1943, a silent revolution was underway. It didn't come from a new superweapon or from the front lines of Kursk or Normandy. It came from the assembly lines of America, from the forges, factories, and machine shops of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. Here, the United States redefined the idea of military power. While Germany built its tanks like luxury cars, precision-engineered, hand-tuned, and painfully slow to replace, the Americans built theirs like trucks, functional, dependable, and infinitely repairable. The Sherman was the perfect expression of that philosophy. It could be manufactured in multiple factories at once without losing quality. Its components were modular, meaning one part from a Chrysler plant in Michigan could fit perfectly into a Sherman built by Fisher Body in Ohio. Crews could strip a tank, swap engines, and reassemble it in a single day. The German Tiger, by comparison, required a factory-level overhaul for most major repairs. The heart of the Sherman lay in its Continental R975 radial engine, originally designed for aircraft. It was simple, robust, and tolerant of dust and low-quality fuel, two enemies of mechanical longevity in war. Where German Maybach engines overheated and seized in muddy fields, the Shermans just kept rumbling forward. But the real magic was not in the machine. It was in the system that supported it. The Americans built an empire of logistics to keep the Sherman alive. Tank transporters, mobile repair units, spare parts convoys, and even floating depots followed every advancing army. A broken Sherman wasn't abandoned. It was towed, repaired, and returned to battle within days. German crews, by contrast, often blew up their own vehicles when breakdowns left them stranded without recovery support. It was a new kind of warfare. Industrial warfare. Every time a Tiger stopped for lack of parts, 3 more Shermans rolled out of a U.S. factory. Every time a Panther's gearbox failed, a dozen American mechanics had already learned how to fix it in the field. German generals like Heinz Guderian lamented it openly. The Allies weren't just fighting with tanks. They were fighting with production lines and logistics networks that Germany could never match. Even fuel told the story. Germany was strangled by shortages. Synthetic fuel plants were bombed. Oil fields in Romania were lost, and the mighty Tiger often sat motionless for lack of diesel. The Sherman, running on more flexible gasoline, drew from the near-infinite reserves of Allied oil convoys. The U.S. Army called it the Red Ball Express, a ceaseless chain of trucks hauling supplies from Normandy beaches to the front lines, keeping the Shermans fed and rolling. American crews began to realize something profound. The Sherman wasn't a perfect tank, but it was a perfect tool for victory. It could cross Europe without stopping for anything more than fuel and basic maintenance. Entire divisions advanced faster than German intelligence could track, not because they had the best weapons, but because their weapons didn't fail. Meanwhile, the myth of German superiority began to crack from within. In the East, Soviet reports captured abandoned Tigers whose transmissions shattered after just a few dozen miles. In Italy, Panther tanks overheated on mountain roads. In Normandy, German tank battalions sometimes lost half their strength before ever engaging the enemy, not to combat, but to mechanical collapse. And still, the Shermans rolled. Through hedgerows, over rivers, across villages turned to rubble, relentless, ordinary, unbreakable. By the spring of 1944, The Allies had achieved what no power in history ever had: a mechanized army that could move, fight, and repair itself faster than the enemy could destroy it. This was not a triumph of armor or firepower. It was a triumph of endurance, a battle won by factories, fuel, and foresight. And soon, on the fields of Normandy, that difference would become impossible to ignore. The same German tank crews who once laughed at the Sherman were about to face the unstoppable machine of logistics and learn, too late, that wars aren't won by the strongest tank, but by the one that keeps driving. To the men who fought inside them, tanks were not statistics. They were homes, prisons, and lifelines on tracks. By 1944, Allied and German tank crews lived entirely different wars inside their steel beasts. Both faced the same dangers: artillery, mines, aircraft. But how they fought, and what they feared, could not have been more different. For German crews, the tank war was a contest of skill and pride. Their Tigers and Panthers were masterpieces, powerful, precise, and terrifying. When a Tiger entered the field, Allied infantry often called for airstrikes before daring to advance. The German gunners, trained with mathematical precision, could hit a Sherman from over a kilometer away. Inside, the noise was deafening, but the confidence absolute. They believed in their machine, believed it was invincible. And yet that confidence came with a cost. Every engagement had to be perfect. Every retreat, every breakdown, felt like a personal failure. The Tigers were so valuable and so scarce that losing one, even to mechanical failure, was a blow to morale. Crewmen often described the stress of being hunted while being the hunter. They knew every Allied gun and aircraft was looking for them. Their tanks were powerful, but they were also large, slow, and vulnerable to encirclement. Across the lines, American crews lived another kind of tension. The Sherman was smaller, lighter, and far less intimidating. Facing a Tiger head-on was suicide. Most crews knew it. They fought with tactics, flanking, teamwork, coordination. U.S. doctrine emphasized mobility over dueling. A single Sherman was weak, but 5 working together were deadly. They would circle, outmaneuver, and swarm their heavier foes, relying on speed and communication rather than raw armor. And here lay the heart of the Sherman's strength. It fit the soldier. Every control, every mechanism was built for simplicity. The transmission was smooth. The visibility was excellent. Crews could escape quickly if hit, a detail that saved countless lives. German tanks were tight, complex, and difficult to exit in emergencies. Many Tiger crews died trapped inside their burning machines. In a Sherman, a trained crew could bail out in seconds. That difference shaped the psychology of war. German tankers trusted their machine but feared its fragility. American crews respected their machine because it forgave their mistakes. If it broke, it could be fixed. If it was hit, there was a good chance they'd survive. That quiet reliability built something stronger than pride. It built confidence. And confidence wins battles. When the Allies broke out of Normandy, Sherman units began advancing with unprecedented momentum. Some drove for hundreds of miles without a major failure. Mechanics followed close behind, carrying spare engines, wheels, and even replacement turrets. It was an industrial ballet. Soldiers, mechanics, and machines moving as one. Meanwhile, German commanders faced a grim reality. Their tanks were magnificent in isolated duels but hopeless in prolonged campaigns. Fuel shortages grounded entire battalions. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. One Panther division lost over a third of its tanks simply due to mechanical issues before the enemy even arrived. And the human toll grew heavier. Veteran tankers who had once mocked Allied designs began to envy them. Captured German diaries reveal frustration. Not fear of the enemy, but despair at their own machines. "We are slaves to the Tiger," one crewman wrote in 1944. "It is strong, but it kills us slowly." In contrast, Allied soldiers began to personify their Shermans. They gave them names: Fury, Killer, Miss America. The tank became a symbol of perseverance. Each patchwork repair, each muddy mile, told a story of endurance. The crews didn't idolize their machines. They trusted them like old friends. Even commanders took note. General George S. Patton, himself a former tank officer, famously said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." His faith in the Sherman wasn't blind. It was practical. He knew the tank's job was to keep moving, to deliver firepower when and where it was needed. It didn't need to win a duel. It needed to win the war. By the fall of 1944, that philosophy was proving itself. The Germans still had the deadliest tanks on paper, but the Americans had something far more valuable: momentum. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the streets of Aachen, Shermans rolled forward through mud, fire, and wreckage. The laughter that once echoed from German ridgelines was fading. For every Tiger that appeared on the horizon, 10 Shermans emerged from the mist, repaired, refueled, and ready. The war of armor was becoming less about strength and more about stamina, and the Germans were beginning to realize they were running out of both. The battlefield was only half the story. Behind every Sherman that rolled through France stood a global machine of engineering, logistics, and strategy unlike anything the world had seen before. What looked like an ordinary tank was, in reality, the physical embodiment of America's industrial doctrine of war. Engineering for endurance. The Sherman's greatest secret wasn't its gun or armor. It was reliability. Engineers at the Ordnance Department understood that no machine was indestructible, so they built one that could be repaired faster than it could be destroyed. Every major component, engine, tracks, transmission, was modular, allowing quick swaps in the field. A damaged German Tiger might take weeks to repair. A Sherman could be restored in a day. Its simple suspension system, the vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, could be serviced without specialized equipment. Mechanics didn't need to return tanks to depots. They worked under tarps beside muddy roads, swapping bogies and wheels like mechanics at a racetrack pit stop. Even ammunition storage reflected practical evolution. Early Shermans were notorious for catching fire when hit. Engineers responded swiftly, adding wet stowage, protective sleeves that reduced fire risk by 75%. No fanfare, no propaganda. Just quiet, relentless improvement. The result was a tank that could outlast not just battles, but entire campaigns. In late 1944, Sherman units of Patton's Third Army advanced across France and Belgium, some logging 2,000 miles of continuous operation. Engines were replaced mid-route, tracks retentioned in hours. Where German divisions halted to refuel, Allied units simply rotated their vehicles. The machine never slept, logistics as a weapon. The Americans understood something the Germans never fully mastered. A tank without fuel or spare parts is just steel. Thus was born one of the most extraordinary logistical networks in military history, the Red Ball Express. Operating between August and November 1944, it moved more than 400,000 tons of supplies across France using 6,000 trucks. Day and night, each convoy kept the Shermans alive. Fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare engines flowed ceaselessly to the front. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, became the unsung heroes of armored warfare. Their work meant that when German panzers stalled, Allied tanks surged forward. In contrast, German logistics had begun to collapse under its own weight. Allied bombing raids crippled rail lines and refineries. The loss of Romanian oil fields starved Hitler's mechanized forces. By late 1944, Tiger battalions were abandoning tanks for lack of fuel. Some commanders ordered their men to destroy vehicles rather than let them fall into Allied hands. The irony was brutal. The very tanks that once inspired terror were now immobile monuments to over-engineering. Strategic philosophy. Quantity has a quality of its own. American commanders never pretended the Sherman was invincible. They knew it would lose head-on fights with Tigers or Panthers, but they also knew those duels were rare. The average tank engagement happened at under 800 meters, often in poor visibility or chaotic terrain. The Sherman's stabilized gun, one of the first in history, allowed it to fire accurately while moving, an advantage the Germans lacked. Most crucially, the Allies could replace losses immediately. For every Tiger destroyed, perhaps one could be replaced in weeks. For every Sherman lost, 3 more rolled off the assembly line within days. This was industrial warfare distilled to its essence. Not about perfection, but persistence. That scale-shaped strategy. While German armor doctrine still emphasized the decisive panzer thrust, Allied strategy embraced continuous pressure. Shermans didn't seek duels. They overwhelmed through presence, through movement, through the simple fact that they were everywhere. This was the dawn of the logistical century. The realization that victory in modern war depended not on brilliance of design, but on systems that endure under strain. The psychological turning point by late 1944, even German officers began to acknowledge the shift. Intelligence reports noted Allied armored columns advancing faster than expected, with vehicles that show no sign of mechanical fatigue. The Tiger, once a symbol of superiority, had become a burden. Captured tankers confessed astonishment. "They never stop," one German lieutenant told Allied interrogators after the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. "We repair for days. They drive for weeks." In those words lay the quiet truth of the Sherman's legend. Its power was not measured in kills, but in miles. Each rotation of its tracks wore down an empire that had built itself on the illusion of perfection. And as autumn turned to winter, the Germans would learn that lesson the hard way. When their prized armor froze in the forests of the Ardennes, and the inferior Shermans rumbled through snow and fire to deliver the final blow. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy roared beneath the thunder of naval guns and the rumble of landing craft. Among the thousands of machines coming ashore, the M4 Sherman was the beating heart of the Allied invasion. It rolled through surf and shrapnel, its tracks gripping the sands of Omaha and Utah Beach, marking the first steps of a 2,000-mile journey across Europe. For many crews, it was their first taste of real war. The stench of cordite, the crack of German 88s, the scream of mortars. German armor, hidden beyond the bocage hedgerows, struck hard and precise. The first weeks were brutal. The Panzerlehr Division, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, and Tiger units of Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 shredded advancing columns. Fields burned with the wrecks of Shermans. But even as Allied losses mounted, something astonishing unfolded. Every night, new tanks arrived on the beaches. Every morning, repaired Shermans re-entered the fight. What began as a fragile foothold became a tidal wave of armor. The War of Endurance begins. The Germans fought with quality. The Allies with continuity. Each Tiger that appeared in a Norman village was a nightmare, its long gun able to pierce a Sherman front to back. But for every Tiger destroyed, it could take weeks for replacements to arrive. The Shermans came daily. American and British crews adapted quickly. They learned to flank, to ambush, to fight as teams rather than individuals. Radio coordination, one of the Allies' secret weapons, allowed tank platoons to share enemy positions instantly. A Tiger crew might destroy one Sherman, but before they could reload, 2 more would fire from the sides. The hedgerows, thick, earthen walls that trapped tanks in narrow lanes, became the testing ground of endurance. German tanks often bogged down or overheated. Shermans, lighter and more agile, carved paths through with rhino tusks, improvised metal cutters welded by field engineers. Every obstacle became an opportunity for innovation. As the Allies pushed inland toward Saint-Lô, Caen, and Falaise, the battle turned into a contest of stamina. The Tigers broke down under the relentless grind. Panthers lost transmissions. Panzerfahrers ran out of fuel. But the Shermans, sustained by endless convoys, kept rolling. By August 1944, the German 7th Army was collapsing. In the Falaise Pocket, encircled by Allied armor, thousands of German troops were captured. Abandoned Tigers and Panthers littered the countryside, not from combat, but from mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion. The 2,000-mile machine. From that moment, the advance became unstoppable. The Shermans surged across France, their engines humming like a single organism. Mechanics replaced engines in barns. Crews rotated shifts but rarely stopped. In 3 months, entire divisions drove from Normandy to the German border, covering nearly 2,000 miles with astonishing reliability. Journalists and officers alike marveled. One report from Patton's Third Army noted, "Our tanks have traveled from the beaches to the Siegfried Line without factory overhaul, a feat unparalleled in any army." German commanders couldn't comprehend it. How could a tank so inferior endure such distances, while their prized Panthers broke down after a few hundred kilometers? The answer lay not in design brilliance, but in simplicity, a virtue that German engineering had dismissed. The Sherman was an engineer's paradox, less sophisticated, yet more capable. Its engine didn't need premium fuel. Its tracks didn't seize in mud. Its crews didn't need weeks of training. It was, in every way, a soldier's tank, forgiving, loyal, tireless. The German perspective, as the Allies crossed the Seine and raced toward Belgium, panic spread among German ranks. Their logistical system had shattered. Allied air supremacy meant every fuel convoy risked annihilation. Even elite Tiger units were ordered to destroy their own tanks and retreat on foot. Field Marshal von Kluge, after the collapse of Normandy, wrote in despair, "Our tanks are no longer instruments of war. They are burdens we cannot move, repair, or fuel." Meanwhile, American units were already pushing into the Netherlands and Luxembourg, their Shermans consuming miles as easily as oxygen. In captured diaries, German officers admitted an unthinkable truth. The enemy's strength was not his tank, but his system. One note found near the ruins of a Panther outside Paris read, "The Americans fight with factories. We fight with museums." By autumn 1944, that system had pushed the Allies to the Rhine. Sherman columns snaked across Europe like an iron river, through bombed towns, across temporary pontoon bridges, over terrain that had crushed the mightiest machines of the Reich. Each tank was a moving testament to the industrial heart beating behind it. And as they neared the German frontier, the myth of German superiority, once forged in the deserts of Africa and the fields of Kursk, was collapsing under the sheer weight of endurance. But the hardest test was still ahead. Winter was coming, and in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the tigers would roar one final time. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were silent under a curtain of snow. The war seemed almost over, until, one freezing dawn, German guns shattered the calm. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. It was Hitler's final gamble, a massive counterattack meant to split the Allied front and seize Antwerp. From the mist rolled the last of Germany's armored might. Panthers, Tigers, and the dreaded King Tigers, their engines growling through the snow-covered pines. To the American infantrymen caught in the path, it was a nightmare reborn. The heavy tanks smashed through villages, crushing resistance, their shells ripping apart Shermans with brutal ease. But this time, something was different. The German advance was a miracle of desperation, not momentum. The mighty tanks were short of everything: fuel, spare parts, even lubricants. Engines froze at night, gearboxes seized in the cold. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a handful of machines moving. For every Tiger that thundered forward, another lay silent, dead not from enemy fire, but from mechanical exhaustion. The Shermans, by contrast, endured the cold like living things. Their gasoline engines started even in sub-zero temperatures. Their crews, hardened by 6 months of non-stop campaigning, adapted instinctively. Field engineers fitted their tracks with snow cleats, used local barns for warmth and maintenance, and improvised with whatever fuel and oil they could find. When the Germans attacked the town of Bastogne, the 10th Armored Division's Shermans held the line under siege for days. Outnumbered and outgunned, they fought from crossroads and forests, turning every delay into an opportunity for reinforcements. Their secret weapon wasn't the gun. It was the fact that they could still move when the enemy could not. The moment of collapse, as the German spearhead pressed west, it consumed its own lifeblood: fuel. Allied bombers had decimated the German oil network months earlier, and now every mile forward brought them closer to starvation. By Christmas, entire Tiger battalions were stranded. Crews abandoned tanks, drained them of fuel, and burned them to prevent capture. A U.S. intelligence report from January 1945 described the scene. The roads are littered with German armor, intact but empty, machines without fuel, frozen monuments to lost mobility. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. Pivoting north through blizzards, thousands of Shermans rolled to relieve Bastogne. They advanced 100 miles in less than 48 hours, through snow, ice, and artillery, an impossible feat for any other tank force of the era. When Patton's lead columns broke through on December 26th, the German offensive was already bleeding out. The last great armored thrust of the Third Reich had frozen in place. Endurance becomes supremacy. In the final months of the war, the contrast could not have been clearer. German engineers still clung to perfection, producing King Tigers so heavy they destroyed roads as they moved. Each one consumed gallons of fuel per mile. The Shermans, refitted with improved guns and engines, simply flowed around them. Their mechanical reliability turned from advantage to domination. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945, the Sherman had become the very symbol of relentless progress. American and British tankers joked that if the war went on another year, their tanks would reach Moscow before breaking down. The statistics told the truth plainly. German Tiger units often averaged 30–40% mechanical readiness. Sherman divisions maintained over 90% operational strength. Even as battle losses mounted, replacements arrived so swiftly that entire divisions seemed to regenerate overnight. For German commanders, the humiliation was complete. What began as a war of precision and prestige had turned into a war of endurance, one they could not win. A Tiger might kill 10 Shermans in a single fight, but when the smoke cleared, the field still belonged to the Americans. The final drive from the Ardennes to the Ruhr, from the Siegfried Line to the Elbe, the Shermans kept rolling. Entire columns drove day and night, their tracks grinding over bridges, rubble, and farmland. Mechanics slept beside the road, woken by the rumble of engines that refused to stop. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, many Shermans were still on the move, some having traveled more than 2,000 miles since Normandy without a single factory overhaul. War correspondents called it the tank that carried victory. Even German prisoners, once so sure of their mechanical superiority, admitted grudging respect. One captured panzer officer said simply, "We built the best tanks in the world. You built the ones that won the world." The Tiger had roared, but the Sherman endured. And in modern war, endurance had become the ultimate weapon. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the war's statistics told a story that numbers alone could barely contain. For years, the Tiger and Panther had been icons of fear, symbols of mechanical and martial superiority. Yet, when measured by endurance, availability, and impact, it was the humble Sherman that carried the weight of victory across a continent. Production. The arsenal of democracy. United States built over 49,000 Shermans during the war. More tanks than Germany produced of all types combined. At the height of production in 1943 to 44, American factories were turning out 2,000 tanks per month. By contrast, Germany's most famous heavy tank, the Tiger I, saw fewer than 1,350 built. Even the versatile Panther only reached about 6,000 units before the war's end. This imbalance wasn't just about quantity, it was about continuity. Every Sherman, regardless of where it was built, could share parts with another. A tank built in a Chrysler plant in Detroit could be repaired with components from a Fisher body plant in Cleveland. German factories, bombed and fragmented, never achieved that kind of standardization. Each variant of the Tiger or Panther demanded its own tools, training, and spare parts. Mechanical availability. In pure mechanical terms, the Sherman was almost indestructible. Field reports from Patton's Third Army recorded average operational readiness of 85–92%, even during the grueling winter of 1944. Tigers rarely achieved more than 40–50% readiness, often lower in adverse weather. The Panther's complicated suspension and transmission proved especially vulnerable. Nearly half of all Panthers lost in 1944 were due to breakdowns, not enemy fire. When a Sherman broke, crews didn't despair. They worked. Engines could be swapped in the field in under 8 hours. Transmissions, the single most failure-prone part of any tank, could be replaced using a mobile crane and a few spare men. German maintenance units required factory-level support and specialized tools they simply no longer had. One American ordnance officer put it bluntly: "A Sherman might die in battle, but a Tiger dies of exhaustion." Combat effectiveness on paper. The Sherman's gun, a 75mm or later 76mm cannon, could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. But real war was not fought on paper. Battlefield studies after Normandy showed that mobility and coordination outweighed raw armor. Shermans fought in groups, supported by artillery and air power. When one was hit, the others flanked. When the Tiger fired, its position was exposed. Allied tankers often called in P-47 Thunderbolts, whose rockets made even the heaviest German armor vulnerable. By late 1944, the Firefly variant, a British adaptation mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun, could destroy any German tank on the field. Together, the combination of quantity, communication, and versatility turned what had once been derided as a medium tank into a force that simply outlasted and outmaneuvered everything it faced. Mileage and longevity. Perhaps the most astonishing figure came not from a battle report, but from a maintenance log. A Sherman from the 4th Armored Division recorded over 2,000 miles of continuous operation from Normandy to Czechoslovakia without a major overhaul, the distance from Paris to Moscow. German Panthers, by comparison, often required drivetrain replacements after 100 to 150 miles. This wasn't luck. It was design, a philosophy that favored practicality over perfection. The Americans understood that a tank which ran reliably was far more valuable than one that dazzled in a duel, but failed to reach the fight. The human cost yet. Numbers cannot capture the human experience within those tanks. For every Sherman that burned, a crew risked everything to keep the advance moving. American and British tankers fought knowing they were often outgunned, but never outlasted. Their courage, amplified by a machine that could endure the impossible, became the soul of the Allied push across Europe. By war's end, even German officers admitted the truth. A captured general summarized it best in a 1946 debriefing: "You Americans could afford mistakes. We could not. You had machines that forgave men. We had machines that demanded perfection. And in war, perfection dies first." In the quiet months after Germany's surrender, Allied commanders walked through the battlefields they had once fought to reach. Burned-out Tigers stood beside intact Shermans that had simply run out of fuel or ammunition. The visual contrast was striking. One tank a monument to engineering genius that had failed its own army, the other a workhorse that had carried millions to victory. Redefining strength. The Second World War redefined what strength meant in war. The Germans had built their tanks as instruments of domination, each a mechanical masterpiece intended to terrify. The Americans and British, by contrast, had built theirs as instruments of continuity, tools of a strategy measured not in single duels, but in endless movement. Historians later called it the victory of systems over symbols. The Sherman was not the best tank in any single category. It was not the fastest, nor the most heavily armed, nor the most armored. Yet it was the only one that achieved what truly mattered: being everywhere, all the time. It embodied the doctrine of reliability as a weapon. This lesson transformed global military thinking. After 1945, tank designers from Moscow to London studied the Sherman's record. The Soviet T-54, the British Centurion, and the American M48 Patton all inherited its philosophy: balance, maintainability, and logistical reach over vanity. The age of the perfect tank had ended. The age of the sustainable war machine had begun. Industrial might as strategy. The Allies' triumph was not accidental. It was industrial by design. Factories that once built cars, tractors, and typewriters had been turned into a single organism of war. This industrial synchronization, the ability to mass-produce, distribute, and repair across an ocean, became the defining American advantage. The Sherman's success was therefore more than mechanical. It was cultural. It reflected a society that valued teamwork, standardization, and adaptability. Each crew, mechanic, and engineer was part of the same rhythm. A breakdown wasn't a failure. It was a temporary problem in a living system that fixed itself and kept moving. The Germans, on the other hand, never escaped their obsession with perfection. Each Tiger was built like an artwork, hand-fitted, hand-welded, and unique. It demanded time and resources that Germany no longer possessed. Their engineers produced excellence, but their soldiers needed endurance. When the war ended, that contrast became the clearest lesson of all. In modern warfare, efficiency is a weapon, and reliability is victory. Legacy of the Sherman decades later, the Sherman continued to fight. In Korea, in the Middle East, in dozens of smaller wars where nations valued its simplicity and resilience. Many remained operational into the 1970s, while Germany's wartime tanks rusted in museums. To historians, it became a paradoxical symbol, the tank that no one feared, yet everyone depended on. Crews who once cursed its thin armor remembered it with affection, because it brought them home alive. Mechanics who maintained them spoke of the engine's steady pulse as if it were a living heart, and for the Germans who once mocked it, the Sherman became a reminder that superiority on paper means nothing when the machine cannot last the journey. A war won by persistence. The story of the Sherman is not one of brilliance, but of balance, of a machine that represented the democratic ideal in mechanical form, accessible, dependable, and resilient. It was the quiet victory of the ordinary over the extraordinary. In every way that mattered, it drove farther, lasted longer, and carried more hope than any tank in history. By the time the last Sherman crossed the Rhine and rolled into Germany's heartland, it had done more than just end a war. It had rewritten the rules of how wars are won. In the ruins of Europe, after the thunder of artillery had faded and the smoke of cities had cleared, the tanks that once defined an age sat silent. Some were shattered, others rusting in the grass. Among them stood the Sherman, scarred, dented, streaked with mud, but still capable of starting its engine. It was not beautiful, it was not perfect, but it had endured. The Sherman story is not about domination or glory, it is about endurance, the quiet, uncelebrated strength that wins wars not through power, but through persistence. It carried its crews through snow and fire across rivers and ruins for 2,000 miles without breaking. In every sense, it became the iron pulse of liberation. Its enemies had laughed at it. They mocked its thin armor, its modest gun, its mass-produced simplicity. Yet when the war was over, it was the machine of laughter that remained, still running, still moving, still alive, while the symbols of superiority lay silent, frozen by their own ambition. In the decades that followed, the lesson of the Sherman outlived the war itself. Nations learned that technology alone does not define victory. Resilience, adaptability, and logistics do. The tank became a mirror of its makers, practical, relentless, unpretentious. It didn't need to be the best. It only needed to be there when it mattered. To the men who drove it, the Sherman was more than steel. It was survival. It was the sound of engines at dawn, the warmth of motion on a frozen road, the comfort of knowing their machine would start one more time. In every revolution of its tracks lay a truth that still echoes through history. Wars are not won by brilliance that burns bright and dies. They are won by the will to keep moving forward. And so, when the German tank crews mocked the Sherman, they never understood what they were really laughing at. They were laughing at endurance itself, at the quiet, unbreakable spirit of a machine that refused to stop, and it never did. If you felt the engine of history today, comment, never stopped rolling. Subscribe for more untold WWII stories.